to give it another minute just to see if others will log on, and then we'll start the presentation. Well, hello. So far we have about 16 registered participants, brave souls and registered participants joining us. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Darrick Eugene with the law firm of Powell and Leon. And also will be joining me is Ms. Joni Boris, who I'm sure many of you know or work with from the law firm of Powell and Leon as well. I'm glad you've taken a few moments to join us to have this discussion about Form 1295 disclosures, the new state disclosure requirements for all governmental entities. And please feel free to email or in the chat arena send us any questions, and we'll take them on a first come, first served basis. Now, jumping right into it. In today's discussion, we're going to focus on the who, what, when, where, and how. So why is Form 1295 required? When is Form 1295 required? What is included on the Form 1295 disclosure? How do you enter the information into the form, or how do you acknowledge a form? And what are the consequences of the new disclosure? The origin of HB 1295, it was authored by State Representative Giovanni Cabriglione out of Tarrant County. It has added new section 2252.908 of the Government Code. And basically, the law requires the disclosure of parties in contracts with governmental entities. We'll get to what the specifics of that entail. Some of you may be aware that it grew out of brouhaha with a particular state agency where there was some inappropriate contracts that were being let and arranged, and that all happened in December of 2014, right before the legislative session. So when we got into the legislative session, it was ripe for considering this kind of disclosure and ethics legislation. The Texas Ethics Commission was required to adopt rules implementing House Bill 2252. They adopted the rules October 5th, 2015. Later, actually they adopted the certificate in October 2015, the rules in November of 2015, and this was all designed to take effect January 1st, 2016. And that's basically when the floodgates opened and everyone began to ask, well, what is this all about? The purpose of Form 1295 of the new state disclosure requirements is basically transparency. At the hearings where Representative Cabriglione laid out the bill and talked about the bill, he often referred to a quote from Justice Louis Brandeis, that sunlight is said to be the best disinfectant. And his goal was to provide information on any contracts between vendors and governmental entities, to provide some disclosure on governmental activity and have that information available to the public. What is all the fuss about? The bill is about a 3-page bill, and if you use a micro text here, you could get it all on one page. And so I just did that to give you an example of all the fuss is caused by a bill which is a few lines long. So when is this process, form, disclosure required? Well, it's required before a governmental entity or state agency can enter certain contracts with a business entity. The business entity must submit Form 1295 at the time or before it submits the signed contract to the governmental entity. So I'll go over that again. Before a governmental entity or state agency can enter certain contracts with the business entity must submit Form 1295 at the time or before it submits the signed contract to the governmental entity. So let's unpack this. First, what is a governmental entity? According to the statute, a governmental entity includes municipality, county, public school district, special purpose district, or authority. And that special purpose district or authority can be any river authority, housing district, hospital district, etc. One of the questions that's often, and I understand we do have some education service centers here, is what about purchasing co-ops and education service centers? And I will come back to that later, but in a conversation with Representative Powell, he has made clear that it was not the intent to include education service centers, that he sees those as state agencies. Well, what kind of contracts are included? Well, according to the Ethics Commission rule, contract includes an amended, extended, or renewed contract and requires action or vote by governing body, or the value of a contract is at least $1 million. So any contract that's being extended, amended, or renewed, and that has to be voted on by the governing body, or is for at least $1 million in value, those contracts will require disclosure on the 1295 form and will be available on the Ethics Commission's website. What kinds of contracts are included? The exceptions are the governing body, where the governing body has legal authority to delegate contracting authority to staff, or the governing body has delegated such authority to staff and does not participate in the selection. And with particularly many school districts, that authority at a certain threshold is delegated to the superintendent or other staff for purchasing. And so if that has taken place and the contract is not for more than $1 million, then that type of contract could be excluded. What is a business entity? Basically, we're talking about a vendor. It includes an entity through which business is conducted with a governmental entity or state agency. It includes both a for-profit entity or a nonprofit entity. It does not include, by rule, a governmental entity or state agency. So interlocal agreements or a work that you do with another state agency, those are not considered business entity, therefore no disclosure is required. So what are you disclosing on the form? Basically, it asks that any interested party involved on the side of the business entity be disclosed. And what is an interested party? It means a person who has a controlling interest in a business entity, or one who acts as an intermediary who facilitates the contract, negotiates the terms of the contract, including a broker, intermediary, advisor, or attorney for the business. And these are all considerations that the business and vendors are having to make in terms of whether they have an interested party involved, what the controlling interest requirements are, and who is an intermediary. The governmental entity doesn't have to be concerned with this aspect of it. This is a burden on the vendor or business entity. So what are the contents of the disclosure form? This is what the form, when it's generated from the Ethics Commission website, is going to look like. Now, let me make it clear that this is all an electronic process. You cannot complete the form by hand. It has to be completed by having a login, ID, information, etc., by both the vendor and the governmental entity. But once a form is generated, this is basically what it's. So what are the contents of the form? Well, the vendor goes in and puts in the name of their business, the name of the governmental entity that they are working with, an identification number used by the governmental entity, basically a unique identifier that's a part of your district or governmental entity, local record keeping requirements, a description of the goods or services, name, location, and nature of the interested party, and then the signature of the authorized vendor representative, and it requires notarization by the vendor and the authorized representative. So that's kind of the information that's on the 1295 disclosure form. So how is the form acknowledged? I will reserve that for the discussion with Joni Burris in a few minutes, but basically just want to let you know that the governmental agency, in this case a school district, will need to go in and acknowledge the form. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and skip to slide, turn this over to Ms. Burris to discuss the steps and procedures for logging in and acknowledging the 1295 disclosure forms.
Hi everybody, my name is Joni. I'm the paralegal here at Powell Leon. I'm going to walk you through setting up your account and logging on to acknowledge your certificates. The first step is to go to the Ethics Commission website, which is ethics.state.tx.us/what's new. I will also be providing this link to y'all at the end of the presentation, so you don't have to write it down right now. Of course, you're going to want to start by clicking Login. A few important notes to make mention is there's a great frequently asked questions portion, and then there's also another video that the Ethics Commission recently put out walking you through all of these steps in case you have any questions, or if there's another user that you're going to put on here who wasn't present for today's presentation, they can get on there and watch this as well. So this is what's going to happen when you go in to log in. Since it's your first time, you're going to want to click this registration button. When you do, it'll pop up. You're basically just going to put in your email, your governmental entity's name, your contact information, make a password, and then you're definitely going to want to select governmental entity/state agency as your user type. After that, you're going to come back over here where we were earlier to the login page. Underneath where you enter your email address and your password, that's where the drop down is, and it'll give it you the option of a governmental entity or of the business entity. Obviously, we'll be picking the governmental entity. After you log in, it's going to ask you to confirm your information just to make sure that your address, email address, phone number hasn't changed. You can click accept on that, or you can click the update button. Either way, you can go up to this button up here, the profile button, and change that at any time. So after you accept that, your screen will come up and you'll have these two options to either manage your profile or manage your forms. You'll definitely want to click on Manage My Forms, and it'll bring you to a page where it shows you all of the certificates that you've acknowledged. They will not appear to you until you acknowledge them. So what you have to wait on is for receiving the notarized copy from the vendor to take the certificate number off of there to input it. When we were looking at the Form 1295 earlier, up here in the office use only, that's where you're going to find that certificate number. So you'll come back in here. Up here it'll ask you to acknowledge a certificate. Carefully enter in the number and select acknowledge the certificate. It will have you enter your certificate number twice just to make sure you have it right. That doesn't finalize it. It'll pop it up and give you the information on the vendor who submitted the certificate. It'll give you their name. It'll give you the contract number. That way you can make sure you're acknowledging the correct certificate. Otherwise, as you can see in the list, there are some of the same named people in there. So you may have 2 or 3 different contracts with the same vendor, but they're associated with different certificates. After you go there, you can select OK. I believe that's what it says. I'm sorry. And now you're done. After you hit that and you acknowledge your certificate, it'll come up in your queue below, and you can see the date that you acknowledged it and the date it was completed. One of the suggestions we had that's very helpful is to go ahead and keep a log, and that way you can keep your ID numbers straight that you're assigning to your different vendors. And it also just kind of helps you keep track of when you told them you needed this, if you received it, when it was acknowledged, what the certificate number is. And it's just kind of a good guideline to help you keep on track with all these contracts. Another suggestion would be when you're about to enter into a contract, we have a form that you might want to send out to them, just letting them know what the new requirements are and what their responsibilities are. And I will go ahead and turn it back over to Mr. Eugene. If y'all have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat below or send me an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Joni. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email us during the presentation or afterwards. I'll be leaving my contact information as well. This is a 30,000-foot review, and many of these situations are very fact-specific in terms of who should be filing, who should be required to file, timing of filing, etc. What are the consequences and impacts of Form 1295? For the governmental entity right now, it's very unclear. Currently, the Ethics Commission has no authority to enforce or interpret the statute. They had only the authority to issue the rules, but in terms of interpreting whether or not a form has been filled out correctly or incorrectly, good faith or bad faith, the Ethics Commission has no authority. With regards to the business entity, this disclosure under oath and under penalty of perjury, which does include some punitive measures. It could be considered a Class A misdemeanor. Now, that requires a certain mens rea or intent to either provide misinformation or not provide the information in good faith. So as long as a business entity or vendor is filling out the form in good faith, there should be no consequences or concerns. But it is something that they are completing under oath and under penalty of perjury. And so the scope of this and the impact right now, in January 2016, when I first did a presentation of this nature, there were about 2,000 submissions of this form. Currently, there are over 10,000 submissions and growing. So it seems to be growing exponentially as entities, governmental entities, municipalities, counties, school districts, hospital districts, etc., are becoming aware of the requirement, the activity, and the information, the disclosure forms that are being submitted are growing exponentially. Some tips, thoughts, traps, ideas. First of all, the thing that I experienced initially when working with the form is the identification number that the vendor will be required to enter into the form. That identification number can be no more than 30 characters, including spaces. It's limited to being 30 characters long. And so if you have a local procedure for maintaining some type of contract number or sequential numbers that you can supply to the vendor, you will have to give them that number, and it'll need to be within that framework of 30 characters or less. We've also found some conventions where unless local procedures of the governmental entity require otherwise, the governmental entity may consider collaborating with or allowing the vendor to designate the contract number. And the reason for that is that contract number is only for the governmental entity or district's internal tracking mechanism or process. You won't see that identification number, contract number anywhere else in this disclosure process. As Joni made clear, once the form is created and submitted, the Ethics Commission assigns a certificate number, which is the keying identifier that both the business entity and the governmental entity use to identify that contract in the Ethics Commission system, not the contract number. Also, with regards to mistakes, pretty much grin and bear it. There is no authorized process for correcting mistakes. Recently, however, the Ethics Commission came out with, as part of their FAQs, a recommendation that basically you can't delete the existing form, but you can submit a second form and just note that it supersedes the prior form. But there's no official mechanism for correcting a mistake. Again, this information currently is only to be used to collect information. It has no punitive measures associated with it currently. However, because of the requirement from the statute to submit this information before or at the time of a contract being entered into, there's a concern of whether it can make a contract voidable. And so that has been one of the concerns in both the administrative and legal community. Now, yesterday, I did have an opportunity to attend a meeting with Representative Capriglione where he wanted to kind of correct certain misperceptions and communicate what his specific intent about the bill was. And then he also sent a letter dated February 1st that addressed three specific things. One, the validity of contracts, saying that the validity of contracts is not targeted. But he went on to say that it's not targeted, and as long as the disclosure form is filed in accordance with the statute prior to the contract, then it shouldn't be any problem. Well, that's kind of circular, because the question is, well, what if it's not filed in advance of the contract, or what if there's a delay or something of that nature? How would that impact the contract? So that question still is unresolved. Again, he specified that there was no intent to include interagency contracts. So that goes back to the question of education service centers and purchasing co-ops, which many school districts enter into and work with. And for now, the protocol or understanding is, with regards to education service centers or regional service centers, that they are a state agency, and therefore in their business dealings in their proprietary dealings with school districts, they would not be required to enter into or make that kind of disclosure. But again, that's not exactly outlined in the statute or in the law, but that protocol is being adopted based upon Representative Capriglione's intent, as well as the statements he's made recently where he doesn't intend to include interagency contracts. Also, one thing that Representative Capriglione is asking the Ethics Commission to consider is to allow the governmental entity to delegate the administrative acknowledgement either to a particular agent or some form of clearinghouse. So the way that mechanism might work is right now the vendor sends a disclosure form to the governmental entity, either hard copy or electronic copy, and then that governmental entity has to go in and acknowledge receipt of that. Well, instead of a vendor sending it to the governmental entity, they might send it to an agent, an attorney for the governmental entity, or some clearinghouse or that clearinghouse would then take on that administrative function of acknowledging receipt of that disclosure form. So those are some of the developments. In the meeting yesterday, there was also discussion of excluding certain types of contracts. Representative Capriglione outlined that his intent was to include a contract such as something that was involving building a new school or building a new road, or a contract to provide a certain number of computers, or a contract to provide consulting services, not necessarily opening a new bank account or establishing a banking relationship, or financing or things of that nature. Also, there was discussion about whether contracts with publicly traded entities are required to go through this. Since there's already so much disclosure required for any kind of publicly traded entity, this would be kind of redundant. So he committed to making certain changes via legislation, which our next legislative session will be in 2017. But we also had representatives at that meeting from the Texas Ethics Commission that will be engaged in another round of rules. And so some of these issues might be addressed in rulemaking as well. So that's our presentation for today. And let's see if we have any questions so far. So we have one question about the sample vendor notification letter, and we will make that available. Any other questions? Another question. What should we do in the meantime with regards to contracts that are still in question? I'm gonna look at that two ways regarding contracts that are still in question with the district. So let's say you're in the process of evaluating a certain type of contract, or you have an RFP out. That's one way of looking at that question. Another way of looking at that question is whether certain categories of contracts have to be submitted. So going back to the issue of purchasing co-ops, and that's still a very unclear area. It is best to proceed with caution. And I think a colleague of mine articulated very well. When in doubt, fill it out. For now, there are no consequences for filling out the information in good faith and making a good faith effort to comply. So I would say when in doubt, fill it out. With regards to, let's say you've got a contract that's under consideration, it hasn't been finalized yet, it would behoove the vendor to submit the disclosure form, to fill it out, have it available, and then the governmental entity, and I apologize that we didn't either address this or highlight this, the governmental entity has 30 days to go in and acknowledge the form. So let's say you're still a week or two out from finalizing a contract, the vendor or business entity could go ahead and complete the information on the Ethics Commission website and either make it available to the district in advance or wait to submit it with their final contract. And from that time that it's been completed online, the governmental entity has 30 days to go in and acknowledge that disclosure form. Okay, we've got another question. Okay, I'm going to read this question because it's a fact-based circumstance. So if an ISD uses a purchasing co-op to meet most needs and has local policy which does not require any budgeted costs outside of construction to come for board approval, the ISD will not have to file the disclosure form until the need arises. In that very fact-specific circumstance, I would agree that if basically the hiring of or the use of that type of purchase of that type of equipment, technology, et cetera, is solely left up to the cooperative, and it's not, no board approval is required, then you would not have to file the disclosure form for that specific circumstance. But some co-ops operate differently, and now the question there is, what is the responsibility of the fiscal agent? Because the retention of the vendor often has to be approved by the fiscal agent. So much of this, the burden of this might fall upon the fiscal agent. Good question. Okay. That seems to be all for today. But again, if you have further questions or follow-up questions, you can please email myself or Joni, and we'd be happy to explore those and provide any support that we can. Thank you for participating, and have a great day and a great weekend.